Sarah Mitchell had learned long ago that respect wasn't given freely in military circles. It had to be earned, shot by shot, mission by mission. Standing at the edge of the bustling Marine Corps recruitment center in downtown Phoenix, she watched a group of fresh-faced recruits gathering around the outdoor training area. Their excited chatter filled the warm Arizona morning as they prepared for what their drill instructor had promised would be an educational experience. The recruitment center had invited Sarah as part of their community outreach program. As a decorated Navy SEAL veteran with 12 years of active duty behind her, she was supposed to inspire these young men and women who were considering military service. What she hadn't expected was to become the center of a brewing controversy that would test not just her skills, but her patience. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a stern-faced Marine with 20 years of experience, had been less than enthusiastic about having a female SEAL address his recruits. Though he kept his opinions professional, Sarah could sense his skepticism. The military had only recently opened all combat roles to women, and old attitudes died hard. Some people still questioned whether women belonged in elite special operations units. "All right, listen up." Rodriguez barked at the assembled group of about 30 recruits. They ranged in age from 18 to 25, a mix of college students, high school graduates, and young adults looking for direction in their lives. Today we have a special guest. This is Sarah Mitchell, former Navy SEAL. She's here to talk about what it takes to serve in special operations. The recruits straightened up, their eyes fixed on Sarah as she stepped forward. At 34, she maintained the lean, athletic build that had served her well during her military career. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore civilian clothes, jeans and a simple black t-shirt that revealed the muscled arms that had carried her through countless missions in Afghanistan and Iraq. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Sarah began, her voice clear and confident. "I know some of you are here because you're thinking about pushing yourselves beyond the standard military experience. You've heard about special operations, about SEALs, Green Berets, Force Recon, and you're wondering if you have what it takes." She paused, scanning the faces before her. Some looked eager, others nervous. A few of the male recruits exchanged glances that she recognized all too well. The look of doubt that questioned whether this woman standing before them really knew what she was talking about. "A special operations isn't about being the biggest or the strongest," Sarah continued. "It's about mental toughness, adaptability, and precision under pressure. It's about making the shot that counts when everything is on the line." "With all due respect, ma'am," interrupted a voice from the back of the group. Sarah looked toward the speaker. A tall, broad-shouldered young man with the kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. His name tag read Jenkins. "But how do we know you actually saw real combat? I mean, weren't SEALs pretty protective of their standards before they had to let women in?" Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward, his face darkening. "Recruit Jenkins, you will show proper respect." Sarah raised a hand, stopping Rodriguez. She had faced this question in various forms throughout her career, and she knew that getting angry or defensive would only reinforce the doubts. Instead, she smiled calmly. "That's a fair question, Jenkins. You want to know if I earned my place or if it was handed to me." She took a step closer to the group. "Let me tell you about Kandahar Province, 2018. My team was tasked with extracting a high-value target from a compound that intelligence said was lightly defended. Turned out, intelligence was wrong." Sarah's voice took on a different quality as she spoke, the tone of someone recounting not a story, but a memory burned into her consciousness. "We were pinned down for 6 hours. Taliban fighters had us surrounded, and our extraction helicopter couldn't get close enough to pull us out. I was the designated marksman for the team, and I had to neutralize 7 enemy combatants at distances ranging from 200 to 800 meters. Every shot had to count because my teammates' lives depended on my accuracy." Jenkins shifted uncomfortably, some of his earlier bravado fading. But another recruit, a stocky young man named Carter, wasn't ready to let it go. "That's a good story, but stories are just words. Anyone can tell war stories." Sarah nodded, understanding the challenge in his voice. "You're right, Carter. Stories are just words. But skills are something different entirely." She looked around the training area and spotted what she was looking for. A shooting range set up at the far end of the compound. It was a simple setup with paper targets at various distances, designed for basic marksmanship training for new recruits. "Tell you what," Sarah said, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Since you're all so concerned about whether I can back up my words with action, how about we settle this right now?" "Ma'am, that might not be necessary." "Oh, but I think it is," Sarah interrupted, her eyes meeting each of the skeptical faces in turn. "Jenkins, Carter, anyone else who has doubts, here's your chance to find out exactly what this female SEAL can do." Some recruits looked excited at the prospect of seeing a demonstration, while others appeared nervous about the confrontation that was brewing. Jenkins and Carter exchanged glances, and Sarah could see them weighing their options. "What exactly are you proposing?" Jenkins asked, trying to maintain his confident tone. Sarah walked over to the weapons rack where several M168-4 rifles were secured. "Simple demonstration. 5 shots, center mass, at 300 yards. Standard combat scenario distance." She paused, letting the challenge sink in. "But to make it interesting, how about this? If I miss even 1 shot from center mass, I'll admit that maybe I didn't earn my place after all, and you can draw your own conclusions about women in special operations." "And if you make all 5? Carter asked. "Then you acknowledge that skills matter more than gender, and maybe, just maybe, you'll listen when someone with experience tries to teach you something." The crowd of recruits had grown as word spread through the training center. Other instructors and administrative staff had gathered to watch what was quickly becoming a defining moment. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez looked torn between shutting down the demonstration and allowing it to proceed. "Ma'am, these recruits are still learning respect and discipline," he said quietly to Sarah. "Maybe we should handle this differently." Sarah appreciated his concern, but she had learned long ago that sometimes the only way to earn respect was to demand it through action. "Staff Sergeant, these young people are going to face real challenges in the military. They need to understand that competence comes in many forms, and that underestimating someone based on preconceived notions can be a fatal mistake in combat." She turned back to the group, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Anyone who wants to take that bet, step forward. Otherwise, we can move on with the planned presentation." Jenkins was the first to step forward, his jaw set with determination. Carter quickly followed, and soon 5 other recruits had joined them. They stood in a line facing Sarah, their body language a mixture of defiance and curiosity. "All right then," Sarah said, reaching for one of the M16s. "Let's see what all the fuss is about." As she checked the rifle's action and examined the scope, Sarah felt the familiar calm that had always settled over her before a crucial shot. The chatter of the crowd faded into background noise, and her world narrowed to the fundamentals that had kept her alive through multiple deployments: breathing, sight alignment, trigger control. The recruits who had challenged her watched with growing intensity as she prepared for the demonstration. What they didn't know was that Sarah had spent the previous weekend at a local shooting range, maintaining the skills that had made her one of the most effective snipers in her SEAL team. The muscle memory was still there, as sharp as ever. She approached the shooting line with the confident stride of someone who had done this thousands of times before. The target at 300 yards looked impossibly small to the watching recruits, but to Sarah it might as well have been across the room. This was the distance at which she had saved her teammates' lives, where she had proven herself again and again in the mountains of Afghanistan. 5 shots, center mass, she announced, her voice steady as she took her position. "Watch and learn." The first shot rang out across the training area, the sharp crack of the rifle cutting through the desert air. Through her scope, Sarah watched the bullet strike exactly where she had aimed, dead center of the target's bullseye. She worked the bolt smoothly, chambering the second round. Behind her, she could hear whispered conversations among the recruits, but she blocked them out. This wasn't about proving anything to them anymore. This was about honoring the skills that had been drilled into her through years of training and combat experience. The second shot followed quickly, then the third. Each bullet found its mark with mechanical precision, grouping tightly in the center of the target. By the fourth shot, the crowd had gone completely silent, watching in fascination, as this woman they had doubted demonstrated abilities that few of them could even imagine possessing. The fifth and final shot was the most important. Sarah took an extra moment steadying her breathing, feeling the familiar weight of the rifle against her shoulder. This shot would either validate everything she had worked for, or give her critics the ammunition they needed to dismiss her accomplishments. She squeezed the trigger with the same gentle pressure she had used to eliminate threats to her team in combat zones thousands of miles away. The rifle bucked slightly against her shoulder, and through the scope, she watched the final bullet join its companions in a tight cluster at the center of the target. Sarah lowered the rifle and turned to face the group of recruits who had challenged her. Their faces showed a mixture of shock, admiration, and embarrassment. Jenkins, who had been so confident in his skepticism just minutes earlier, now looked like he wanted to disappear into the desert sand. 5 for 5, Sarah announced simply, her voice carrying no hint of boasting or triumph. Center mass as requested. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez walked down range to examine the target, shaking his head in amazement. When he returned, he held up the paper for everyone to see. All 5 shots had landed within a circle no larger than a silver dollar, clustered so tightly that they almost overlapped. "Outstanding shooting, ma'am," Rodriguez said, his earlier skepticism completely gone. "I've seen a lot of marksmen in my time, but that was exceptional." Sarah nodded her thanks, then turned her attention back to the chastened recruits. "Now that we've settled the question of whether I know what I'm talking about, let's discuss what really matters. What it takes to earn your place in special operations, regardless of who you are or where you come from." The silence that followed Sarah's demonstration stretched for several long seconds. Jenkins stood with his mouth slightly open, staring at the target that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez still held. The 5 bullet holes clustered in the center seemed to mock his earlier confidence. Jenkins stood with his mouth slightly open. Carter shuffled his feet in the sand, unable to meet Sarah's eyes. The other recruits who had joined the challenge looked equally uncomfortable, realizing they had just witnessed something far beyond their current abilities. Sarah set the rifle aside and walked closer to the group. Her expression wasn't triumphant or smug. Instead, she looked like a teacher preparing to deliver an important lesson to students who had finally earned the right to hear it. "I want everyone to understand something," she began, her voice carrying the authority that came from real combat experience. "What you just saw wasn't magic. It wasn't natural talent. It was the result of thousands of hours of training, hundreds of missions, and learning from mistakes that could have gotten me or my teammates killed." She gestured toward the target downrange. "Those shots represent 12 years of military service, including 4 combat deployments. They represent getting up at 0500 every morning to practice fundamentals until they became second nature. They represent accepting criticism from instructors who pushed me harder than I thought I could be pushed, because they knew that one day my life might depend on those skills." Jenkins finally found his voice, though it came out much quieter than his earlier challenges. "Ma'am, I apologize for what I said earlier. I guess I didn't really understand what we were dealing with." Sarah studied his face, looking for sincerity behind the words. "Jenkins, apologies are easy. What matters is whether you learned something today that will make you a better soldier, sailor, or Marine." She turned to address the entire group, not just those who had challenged her. "Every one of you came here because you're looking for something more than ordinary life can offer. You want to test yourselves, to find out what you're really made of. That's admirable, but it's also dangerous if you approach it with the wrong mindset." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been watching the interaction with growing respect for Sarah's handling of the situation. He had seen plenty of guest speakers over the years, but few who could turn a moment of confrontation into a teaching opportunity with such skill. "The military isn't about proving you're better than someone else," Sarah continued. "It's about proving you can be better than you were yesterday. When I went through Bud/S training to become a SEAL, I wasn't competing against the men in my class. I was competing against my own limitations." A young woman in the group who had been quiet throughout the earlier confrontation raised her hand. "Ma'am, how did you deal with people who said you didn't belong there? Before you had combat experience to point to?" Sarah smiled, recognizing the genuine nature of the question. "What's your name?" "Patricia Valdez, ma'am. I'm thinking about trying for Force Recon." "Good choice, Patricia. Force Recon Marines are some of the finest warriors I've ever worked with." Sarah paused, considering how to answer the question honestly without discouraging the young woman. "The truth is, I faced doubt and skepticism from the moment I decided to pursue special operations. Some of it was overt, like what happened here today. Some of it was more subtle. Instructors who seemed to expect me to fail, teammates who questioned whether I could pull my weight. She walked over to a wooden bench near the shooting line and sat down, gesturing for the recruits to gather around. The formal atmosphere of the demonstration was giving way to something more intimate and personal. But here's what I learned, Sarah continued. Other people's expectations, positive or negative, are just noise. What matters is your own commitment to excellence. When someone tells you that you can't do something, you have two choices. You can let that define your limits, or you can use it as motivation to prove them wrong. Carter, who had been one of her more vocal challengers, stepped forward. Ma'am, how do you know when you're ready? I mean, how do you know if you have what it takes for special operations? Sarah appreciated the question because it showed that Carter was thinking seriously about his future rather than just posturing. That's the right question to ask, Carter. And the honest answer is that you never really know until you're tested. But there are indicators you can look for in yourself. She held up one finger. First, are you willing to accept that you don't know everything? Can you take criticism and use it to improve, or do you get defensive and make excuses? She glanced meaningfully at Jenkins and Carter, who both looked uncomfortable but attentive. A second finger joined the first. Second, can you push through discomfort and keep functioning when everything goes wrong? Special operations isn't about being comfortable. It's about performing your job when you're exhausted, scared, cold, hungry, and everyone around you is counting on you to succeed. Third, she continued, raising a third finger, are you willing to put the team before yourself? In combat, individual heroics usually get people killed. Success comes from everyone doing their job perfectly, trusting their teammates to do the same. A recruit named Thompson raised his hand. Ma'am, what was the hardest part of your training? Sarah was quiet for a moment, her mind going back to those grueling months of Bud/S training. The hardest part wasn't the physical challenges, although they were brutal. It wasn't even the mental stress, though, that nearly broke me several times. The hardest part was learning to trust completely in people I barely knew. She stood up and began pacing slowly in front of the group, her movements unconsciously falling into the rhythm of a patrol. In my third week of training, we were doing a night navigation exercise. I was paired with a teammate who I'll call Mike. We had been having personality conflicts. He thought I was trying too hard to prove myself, and I thought he was trying to undermine my confidence. The recruits were completely absorbed in her story, drawn in by the obvious authenticity of her recollection. Even Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had moved closer to listen. The exercise was supposed to be simple. Navigate to 3 checkpoints in the dark, using only compass and map, then return to base. But during the second leg of the journey, I twisted my ankle badly crossing a creek. I mean badly. I could barely put weight on it. Sarah paused her pacing and looked directly at the assembled recruits. Mike could have left me behind. It would have been the smart tactical decision. One person completing the mission was better than both of us failing. Instead, he spent the next 4 hours helping me navigate terrain that should have taken us 1 hour to cover. Did you complete the exercise? Patricia asked. We did, and more importantly, I learned that the person standing next to you isn't your competitor. They're your lifeline. From that night forward, Mike and I had each other's backs completely. 6 months later, when we were deployed to Afghanistan together, that trust saved both our lives more than once. Jenkins had been listening intently, and now he spoke up again. Ma'am, when you were in combat, how did you deal with did the enemy treat you differently because you were a woman? It was a question that Sarah had been asked many times, and she had learned to answer it with brutal honesty. The enemy didn't care about my gender, Jenkins. Bullets don't discriminate. When Taliban fighters were shooting at my position, they weren't thinking about whether I was male or female. They were thinking about eliminating a threat to their operations. She let that sink in before continuing. But if you're asking whether I faced different challenges because I was a woman in a male-dominated field, the answer is yes. I had to be better prepared, more physically fit, more mentally tough than some of my male counterparts because I was always being watched more closely. Every mistake I made was seen as proof that women didn't belong in special operations. How did you handle that pressure? Carter asked. I used it, Sarah replied simply. Instead of resenting the extra scrutiny, I embraced it. I made sure that I was always the first person ready for a mission, the last person to complain about conditions, and the most reliable team member in any situation. Eventually, my teammates stopped seeing me as the female SEAL and started seeing me as just another operator they could count on. A new voice spoke up from the back of the group. "Ma'am, did you ever think about quitting?" Sarah turned to see who had asked the question. It was a young man who looked barely 18, with the kind of earnest expression that suggested he was genuinely concerned about his own potential for success. "What's your name, son? I'm thinking about trying for the Rangers." "Rangers lead the way," Sarah replied, giving him the traditional Ranger motto. "To answer your question, Marcus, yes, I thought about quitting. Multiple times. During Hell Week and Bud/S training, I was so exhausted and beaten down that quitting seemed like the most rational decision I could make." She walked over to where Marcus stood and looked him directly in the eyes. "But here's what I learned about quitting, Marcus. The moment when you most want to quit is usually the moment when you're closest to breakthrough. The instructors aren't just testing your physical limits. They're testing your mental resilience. Can you continue functioning when every fiber of your being is telling you to stop?" "What kept you going?" Marcus asked. Sarah smiled, remembering those dark moments when giving up had seemed so tempting. "Two things. First, I had made a promise to myself that I would find out exactly what I was capable of achieving. Quitting would have meant I'd never know the answer to that question." She paused, looking around at all the faces focused on her words. "Second, I thought about all the people who had told me I couldn't do it. My high school guidance counselor, who said the military wasn't for girls like me. The recruiter who tried to steer me toward a desk job. The drill instructor in boot camp who said I'd never make it through advanced training. Every time I wanted to quit, I reminded myself that giving up would prove them right." "Did that make you angry?" Patricia asked. "At first, yes. But anger is a terrible long-term motivator because it burns out quickly. I had to transform that anger into something more sustainable, determination. The difference is that anger focuses on other people, while determination focuses on your own goals and values." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez checked his watch and stepped forward. "Ma'am, we have about 15 more minutes before these recruits need to move to their next session." Sarah nodded, realizing that her impromptu lesson had consumed more time than planned. But looking at the engaged faces around her, she could see that the time had been well spent. These young people were asking the right questions now, thinking seriously about what military service, especially elite military service, would really require of them. "Let me leave you with one final thought," she said, addressing the entire group. "Today, some of you challenged me because you doubted my qualifications. That's actually not a bad instinct. You should demand proof of competence from anyone who claims to have expertise, but make sure you're challenging the right things." She gestured toward the target that still showed the results of her demonstration. "Don't challenge someone's right to be there based on their gender, race, background, or any other characteristic they can't control. Challenge their preparation, their commitment, their willingness to do the work necessary to succeed. Those are the things that actually matter in combat." Jenkins stepped forward, his posture more respectful than it had been at any point during the session. "Ma'am, I want to apologize again, but more specifically this time. I challenged your qualifications based on assumptions that had nothing to do with your actual abilities. That was wrong, and it was stupid." Sarah extended her hand to Jenkins, who shook it firmly. "Apology accepted, Jenkins. But more importantly, I hope you've learned something about making assumptions that will serve you well throughout your military career and your life." One by one, the other recruits who had challenged her came forward to shake her hand and offer their own apologies. But Sarah could see that this was about more than just saying sorry. These young people had experienced a fundamental shift in their thinking about what it meant to earn respect and demonstrate competence. 6 months later, Sarah received an unexpected phone call at her consulting firm in San Diego. She had transitioned out of active duty and was now working with defense contractors, using her special operations experience to help develop better training programs for military and law enforcement agencies. "Miss Mitchell? This is Staff Sergeant Rodriguez from the Marine Corps Recruitment Center in Phoenix. Do you remember me?" Sarah smiled, setting down the training manual she had been reviewing. "Of course, Staff Sergeant. How could I forget? How are things going with your recruits?" "That's actually why I'm calling, ma'am. I wanted to give you an update on some of the people you met during your visit here." Sarah leaned back in her chair, curious. She had given dozens of similar presentations over the past few months, but the confrontation in Phoenix had stayed with her. Those recruits had challenged her in a way that forced her to articulate things she usually took for granted. "I'm listening," she said. "Well, first off, Patricia Valdez, the young woman who asked about Force Recon. She just graduated from the School of Infantry and has been accepted into the Force Reconnaissance selection process. Her instructors say she's one of the most motivated and prepared candidates they've seen in years. That's outstanding news, Sarah replied, genuinely pleased. She had sensed something special in Patricia during their conversation, a quiet determination that reminded Sarah of herself at that age. But here's the interesting part, Rodriguez continued. She credits your visit with helping her understand what she was really signing up for. She said that watching you handle those challenges from Jenkins and Carter showed her that competence speaks louder than anything else. Sarah remembered Patricia's thoughtful questions and her obvious interest in special operations. She was asking the right questions that day. I could tell she was serious about her goals. Marcus Williams is another success story. Remember him? The young man who asked about quitting? The one interested in the Rangers, Sarah confirmed. How's he doing? He's currently in week 3 of Ranger Assessment and Selection Program. According to his cadre, he's never even come close to quitting, not once. They say he has this mental toughness that's unusual for someone his age. Rodriguez paused and Sarah could hear papers rustling in the background. But the biggest surprise has been Jenkins. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Jenkins had been the most vocal in challenging her credibility, the one who had questioned whether she had really earned her place in the SEALs. What about Jenkins? He's currently in Navy boot camp, and he specifically requested to be considered for SEAL training. His drill instructors say they've never seen a recruit more focused on preparing for Bud/S. He spends every free moment studying SEAL history, physical training, and mental preparation techniques. That is surprising, Sarah admitted. What changed his mind? I think you did, ma'am. After you left that day, Jenkins came to me privately. He said that watching you demonstrate your skills made him realize he had been focusing on the wrong things. Instead of looking for reasons why people couldn't succeed, he wanted to start focusing on what it would take for him to succeed. Rodriguez continued. He also said something that stuck with me. He said that when you made those 5 shots, it wasn't just about proving you were a good marksman. It was about showing that excellence comes from preparation and dedication, not from fitting some preconceived idea of what a warrior should look like. Sarah found herself unexpectedly moved by this news. She had hoped that her demonstration would teach those recruits something about assumptions and respect, but she hadn't expected it to have such a lasting impact on their career choices. What about Carter? She asked. He was the other vocal skeptic that day. Carter enlisted in the Army and is currently in infantry training. He's not pursuing special operations, but his drill sergeants say he's one of the most coachable recruits they've ever worked with. He never argues with instruction, never makes excuses, and he's always encouraging his fellow soldiers to push themselves harder. Rodriguez's voice took on a more personal tone. Ma'am, I have to tell you, that day changed things for me too. I've been in the Marines for 20 years and I thought I had seen everything. But watching you handle that situation, the way you turned a confrontation into a teaching moment, that was masterful leadership. I appreciate you saying that, Staff Sergeant. No, ma'am. I'm serious. I've been incorporating some of your techniques into my own interactions with recruits. When someone challenges authority or questions whether they belong here, instead of just shutting them down, I try to turn it into a conversation about what they're really asking. How has that been working? Better than I expected. We're seeing fewer disciplinary problems and more genuine engagement from recruits. They're asking better questions and taking more ownership of their development. Rodriguez paused again, then continued with obvious satisfaction in his voice. But here's the thing that really impressed me, ma'am. About a month after your visit, we had another guest speaker, a former Army Special Forces officer. One of the new recruits started getting mouthy, questioning the speaker's credentials in a way that reminded me a lot of Jenkins that day. What happened? Jenkins shut him down. Not aggressively, but firmly. He stood up and said something like, "Before you start running your mouth, maybe you should listen to what this person has to say. Competence isn't about what someone looks like or what you expect. It's about what they've done and what they can teach us." Sarah felt a warm sense of satisfaction hearing this. The real test of any lesson wasn't whether someone could repeat it back to you, but whether they could apply it in new situations. That's exactly the kind of leadership we need more of in the military, Sarah replied. It sounds like Jenkins really internalized the message. He did. And it's spreading to other recruits too. We're seeing a different culture developing here. One where people challenge ideas and preparation rather than making assumptions about people. Rodriguez cleared his throat. Actually, ma'am, that brings me to the real reason I called. We'd like to invite you back for another presentation, but this time we want to make it a regular thing. Maybe quarterly visits where you can work with our recruits on both marksmanship and leadership development. Sarah considered the proposal. Her consulting business was doing well, but there was something deeply satisfying about working directly with young people who were making the same kinds of decisions she had made years earlier. I'd be interested in that, Staff Sergeant. What did you have in mind? We're thinking about developing a program we'd call Excellence in Leadership. The idea would be to bring in experienced special operations veterans, male and female, to work with recruits on the mental and psychological aspects of military service. Not just the technical skills, but the mindset and character traits that separate good soldiers from great ones. Sarah liked the sound of that. Who else would be involved? We're reaching out to retired Green Berets, Force Recon Marines, Air Force pararescue men, and other SEAL veterans. The goal is to give recruits exposure to different perspectives on leadership and excellence. That sounds like a program that could have real impact, Sarah said. Count me in. 3 months later, Sarah found herself back at the Phoenix Recruitment Center. But this time, the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of skeptical challenges, she was greeted by a group of recruits who had clearly prepared for her visit. They had researched her background, studied the basics of marksmanship, and prepared thoughtful questions about military service and leadership. Patricia Valdez was there, now wearing the uniform of a Marine, and preparing for her final phase of Force Recon selection. She had requested leave specifically to attend Sarah's presentation and to help with the newer recruits. Ma'am, Patricia said as she approached Sarah before the session began, I wanted to thank you personally for what you shared with us during your last visit. It completely changed how I approached my training. How so? Sarah asked. You said that the person standing next to you isn't your competitor. They're your lifeline. That insight transformed how I worked with my fellow Marines during training. Instead of trying to prove I was better than everyone else, I focused on making sure everyone in my unit succeeded. Patricia's eyes lit up with enthusiasm as she continued. It made such a difference in how my instructors and fellow Marines saw me. Instead of being the woman who was trying too hard to prove herself, I became known as the Marine who could be counted on to help others succeed. That reputation has opened doors that I never expected. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of leadership the military needs more of. How has it affected your own performance? When you stop worrying about proving yourself and start focusing on mission success, everything becomes clearer. My shooting improved because I wasn't tense about being judged. My physical performance got better because I was concentrating on the task instead of on how others might perceive my effort. Sarah was about to respond when she noticed a familiar face approaching. It was Jenkins, now wearing navy dress blues and sporting the confident bearing of someone who had successfully completed basic training. Ma'am, Jenkins said, offering a crisp salute. Petty Officer Jenkins reporting. I wanted to let you know that I successfully completed boot camp and have been accepted into BUD/S training, which begins next month. Sarah returned his salute and shook his hand. Congratulations, Jenkins. That's no small accomplishment. How are you feeling about the challenge ahead? Nervous, but prepared, he replied honestly. I've been using the mental framework you shared with us during your last visit. Instead of worrying about whether I belong there or whether I'm good enough, I've been focusing on preparation and continuous improvement. He paused, looking slightly embarrassed. Ma'am, I also wanted to apologize one more time for how I acted during your first visit. I've thought about that day a lot over the past few months, and I realized that my challenges weren't really about you at all. They were about my own insecurities. Sarah appreciated his honesty. What do you mean by that? I was scared that I wouldn't be good enough for special operations, so I was looking for reasons why others might not belong there either. It was easier to question your qualifications than to face my own doubts about myself. That's a very mature insight, Jenkins. How has that realization changed your approach to training? I've stopped looking for reasons why I might fail and started focusing on the work necessary to succeed. Every day I ask myself what I can do to be better prepared, more physically fit, more mentally tough. It's made all the difference in my performance." As Sarah listened to Jenkins, she realized that this was perhaps the most important outcome of her confrontation with the recruits months earlier. She hadn't just taught them about respect or competence. She had helped them understand something fundamental about personal growth and self-improvement. The formal presentation that day went smoothly, with engaged recruits asking sophisticated questions about leadership, teamwork, and mental resilience. But the real highlight came at the end, when Patricia and Jenkins took turns addressing the newer recruits about what they had learned from Sarah's previous visit. "The most important thing I learned," Patricia told the group, "is that excellence isn't about meeting other people's expectations. It's about consistently exceeding your own standards and helping others do the same." Jenkins nodded in agreement. "And don't waste time looking for reasons why you or others might fail. Spend that energy on preparation and improvement instead. The only opinion that matters is the one backed up by performance." As Sarah drove back to San Diego that evening, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with a simple demonstration of marksmanship. Those 5 shots had been intended to prove a point about competence and respect, but they had ended up teaching lessons about leadership, personal growth, and the power of turning challenges into opportunities. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. "Another successful session, ma'am. The recruits are already asking when you'll be back. The culture change here has been remarkable. Thank you for helping us build something special." Sarah smiled as she read the message. In her years of military service, she had learned that the most meaningful victories weren't always the obvious ones. Sometimes, the greatest impact came from moments of connection and understanding that rippled outward in ways you never anticipated. The 5 shots she had fired that day in Phoenix had hit their target with precision, but the lessons they had triggered were still finding their mark in the lives of young people across the country. And that, Sarah realized, was a legacy worth building on.